My name is Evelyn, and on the quiet, crisp evening of my 70th birthday, I found myself engaged in the solitary act of waiting. A rich, savory aroma, the signature scent of my late husband Richard's favorite chicken parmesan, had patiently filled every corner of our Naperville home for hours. Richard always claimed it was the official fragrance of a happy household, a culinary testament to celebration and togetherness. It was precisely this feeling I had meticulously sought to recreate. A warm bastion against the pervasive silence that had taken up residence since his passing 2 years ago. The grand mahogany dining table, an heirloom he had inherited and cherished, stood as a silent, expectant stage, set for six, for this occasion. I had retrieved our wedding china from its velvet-lined storage, the plates with the delicate afampo, hand-painted gold trim that we had vowed to use only for the most significant milestones of our life together. Each piece of silverware was aligned with a methodical precision that spoke of my lifelong profession as an archivist, a career where comfort was found in order, history, and the quiet dignity of preservation. The grandfather clock in the hallway, another steadfast piece of Richard that remained, marked 7:15 with its deep, solemn chime. Clara, my only daughter, had promised on our last call that they would arrive by 7 sharp. Her voice had been full of a bright, if somewhat hurried, energy. She and her husband, Ethan, were bringing his parents, and I had genuinely looked forward to the warmth of a full table, to the low hum of overlapping conversations, and the easy laughter that had once been the very lifeblood of our family. I ran my hand over the smooth, cool surface of the tablecloth, my gaze drifting to the gallery of memories on the mantelpiece. There was Richard and me, squinting in the sun on our wedding day. There was Clara at 5 years old, her smile a triumphant, gap-toothed grin as she held up a crayon drawing of our family. I lingered on a photo from her college graduation. In it, her arm was draped casually around my shoulder, her expression one of unbridled, effortless joy. A familiar, dull ache settled in my chest as I wondered where that unguarded, radiant girl had gone, replaced by a woman whose voice often sounded like she was reading from a script. By 8 o'clock, the perfect golden brown crust on the chicken had begun to lose its inviting crispness. My mind, ever the archivist, began constructing a catalog of plausible explanations, a sudden, unexpected jam on the expressway, a last-minute business crisis demanding Ethan's immediate attention. These were logical possibilities, a thin but necessary shield against the creeping chill of disappointment. But the telephone on the end table remained dark and stubbornly silent. It offered no updates, no apologies, no explanations at all. The silence in the house began to feel heavier, more profound, transforming from mere quiet into a palpable presence. When the clock chimed 9, each stroke felt like a small final verdict. The 70 slender candles I had carefully arranged on the angel food cake now stood in shallow, colorful pools of their own wax, their postures slumped in what looked like shared defeat. With a slow, steadying breath, I walked to the table where the cake sat untouched. I leaned forward, not with the hopeful anticipation of a birthday wish, but with the quiet finality of acknowledging a truth I could no longer ignore. 70 small flames flickered and danced for a moment, then vanished, their smoke coiling into the still air before disappearing completely, just like the hope I had held on to all evening. The party was over. No one was coming. The telephone's shrill ring at nearly 9:30 was a violent intrusion, shattering the tomb-like silence that had settled over the kitchen. The sound was so jarring it made me flinch, my heart giving a painful lurch with a sudden, illogical surge of relief. It was Clara. My mind, desperate for a benign explanation, instantly concluded that some terrible but understandable emergency must have occurred. My first coherent thought was only for their safety. I took a deep, steadying breath, commanding my voice to be calm as I answered the call. Clara, my dear, is everything all right? Her response was immediate, delivered with a polished, frictionless ease that felt entirely rehearsed. Mom, I am so profoundly sorry about tonight. We became entangled in a significant strategic priority conflict at the last minute. It was just completely and utterly unavoidable. The phrase landed in my ear with a dull thud. Strategic priority conflict. It was the sterile, lifeless language of a corporate boardroom, an empty and meaningless collection of syllables used to paper over a deeply personal betrayal. As she continued with a string of similar platitudes, I became aware of a faint, rhythmic sound bleeding through the line from her end. It was a gentle, persistent cadence that was certainly not the sound of city traffic. It was the soft, sighing whisper of ocean waves meeting a sandy shore, punctuated by the distant, cheerful thrum of a steel drum. My own home, with its heavy scent of cold chicken and wilted birthday hopes, felt a million miles away. It sounds very peaceful where you are, I commented, my voice a carefully constructed mask of maternal gentleness, while my heart began a slow, heavy drumbeat of its own. A brief pause followed, a silence that stretched just a fraction of a second too long, a tiny crack in her otherwise seamless performance. "Oh, that," she said, her laugh a little too bright, a little too loud. "It's just a new sound machine Ethan bought. He insists on using it to de-stress. This whole situation at his firm has been incredibly demanding." And the lie was so transparent, so artlessly constructed, that it felt more insulting than the truth it was meant to hide. My daughter was performing for me, and her husband was the puppeteer pulling the strings. I did not challenge her. I did not tear down the flimsy curtain of her deception. Richard's calm voice echoed in my memory, a wise counsel from years past, warning that you cannot win a tug of war with someone who has already let go of the rope. So I simply played my part, my own voice now feeling as hollow as hers. "I understand, sweetheart. I hope everything is resolved soon. We can always find another time to celebrate." After the call ended, I sank into Richard's worn leather armchair, the oppressive silence of the house rushing back in to fill the space her voice had occupied. A cold, hard certainty began to crystallize in my chest, replacing the dull ache of sadness, driven by an impulse that felt both foreign and necessary. I walked to the desk and opened my laptop. I rarely ventured into the bewildering world of social media, with its endless competitive parade of curated joy. But tonight was different. Tonight, I needed to see the version of reality she was not willing to share. With fingers that felt clumsy and slow on the keyboard, I navigated the unfamiliar interface to Ethan's profile page, and there, posted just an hour before Clara's phone call, was the truth in vibrant, high-definition color. The photograph showed the four of them: Clara, Ethan, and his smiling parents on a pristine, white sand beach, their faces illuminated by the warm glow of a setting sun. They were holding colorful, exotic-looking drinks, their smiles wide and aggressively cheerful for the camera. The location was tagged Grand Oasis Resort, Cancun, and Ethan's caption, typed out below the image, was "the final, devastating blow." Nothing is more important than quality time with the people who truly matter. So blessed to be making memories with my real family. I sat there for a very long time in the growing darkness of my living room, the only light coming from the laptop screen, where my daughter smiled from a beautiful, sun-drenched world I was not a part of. The message was no longer a suspicion. It was a clear and deliberate declaration. In their new, carefully curated life, I was not real. For 2 full days following the stark revelation of the Cancun photograph, I existed in a disorienting fog of quiet disbelief. The pain was a tangible weight, a constant, dull pressure behind my ribs that made each breath a conscious and weary effort. I moved through the familiar rooms of my house like a visitor, where the lingering scent of the uneaten birthday dinner served as a constant, cloying reminder of my foolish, misplaced hope. But on the third morning, as the pale dawn light filtered through the kitchen window, something fundamental shifted within me. while staring at the cheerful, chaotic collection of magnets holding Clara's childhood artwork to the refrigerator door. The heavy fog of grief began to recede. It was replaced not by the hot burn of anger, but by a cold and unfamiliar clarity. The archivist in me, the part of my mind that Richard had always lovingly called my internal librarian, began to awaken. It was a part of my consciousness trained to seek out patterns, to connect disparate facts, and to construct a coherent, evidence-based narrative from a chaos of information. This was no longer just a personal wound to be nursed. It had become a historical problem, a complex manuscript that required careful, methodical, and unemotional analysis. That afternoon, I began the ritual of dismantling the shrine to my failed party. The pristine wedding china, each piece a vessel of memory, was carefully washed, dried, and returned to the safety of its velvet-lined storage boxes. The untouched birthday cake was discarded, its promise of sweetness having turned bitter in my memory. I cleared the mahogany dining table completely. In place of the festive tablecloth and polished silverware, I placed my laptop, a fresh legal pad, and a single, sharply pointed pencil. In a matter of minutes, the space was transformed. It was no longer a symbol of abandoned celebration. It had been repurposed into my private research center, also, my own quiet archive for the singular investigation at hand. My subject was Ethan. My objective was the unvarnished truth, stripped of all sentiment. I did not begin with aimless, emotional searches, but with process and order. My first action was to create a new password-protected folder on my computer's desktop, giving it the simple, sterile label EV Investigation. My initial task was to establish a baseline of verifiable facts, a solid foundation upon which I could build the rest of the case. I started with the public face of his operation, the impressively named Horizon Equity Partners. I navigated to the official Illinois Secretary of State business search portal, a dry, text-heavy website whose interface was comfortingly familiar from my years of genealogical research at the library. The limited liability company was registered, as expected, listing a prestigious address in a downtown Chicago high-rise. On the surface, it was all perfectly and professionally legitimate. My next stop was the official website for the Illinois Department of Financial and Professional Regulation. This was the governing body that oversaw real estate licenses, the very source of Ethan's professional authority and credibility. With methodical care, I typed his full name into the licensee search field and held a breath I didn't realize I was holding. His record appeared, his license listed as active and in good standing at first glance. But as I scrolled down, my eyes, trained to spot anomalies, caught a small, hyperlinked phrase tucked away at the bottom of the page: disciplinary action taken. I clicked it. A PDF document instantly opened, filled with the dense, impersonal language of legal proceedings. But the facts within were stark and clear. Just last year, Ethan's license had been placed on a 90-day suspension. The official reason cited was commingling of client funds. I read the phrase several times. It was a sterile, bureaucratic term, but its meaning was ugly and intimate. He had mixed his own money with that of the people who trusted him. It was the first verifiable crack in the polished facade he presented to the world, a documented flaw in his character. This discovery emboldened me. I moved from the official archives to the unofficial one's online business reviews. I sifted through dozens, using my archivist's eye to disregard the overly emotional, unsubstantiated rants, as well as the suspiciously glowing 5-star reviews that were all posted within the same week. I was searching for specific, detailed narratives. And then I found it. A long, carefully written 1-star review from a user identified only as J.R. from Oak Park. The user recounted, in painful detail, being relentlessly pressured by Ethan into a significant investment in an off-plan luxury resort development in Mexico. The projected returns were, of course, astronomical. But once the funds were wired, communication had faltered, construction deadlines were endlessly pushed back, and the entire project eventually dissolved into a series of unanswered emails and disconnected phone numbers. The money was simply gone. The word Mexico pulsed on the screen, a powerful, undeniable beacon connecting this stranger's painful story directly to the sun-drenched photograph of my daughter. This trip was not a vacation. It was a visit to the scene of a crime. A profound and chilling dread settled deep in my bones. This was so much bigger, so much more dangerous than a missed birthday party. The meticulously detailed review from J.R. from Oak Park was the critical piece of evidence. The single, compelling manuscript that suggested the existence of a much larger, hidden collection of similar stories. However, its author remained anonymous, a ghost in the machine. And I knew that contacting him directly was a near impossibility. The official channels and mainstream review sites had yielded their initial secrets. To find more, to understand the true scope of this, I knew I had to venture deeper into the less traveled, uncatalogued corridors of the digital world. An archivist instinctively knows that the most revealing history is often found not in the officially sanctioned records, but in the private letters, the forgotten diaries. In the unofficial stories people tell one another when they believe no one of a position of authority is listening. My task was to find the digital equivalent of that hidden confessional space. I began to employ the more sophisticated search techniques I had taught myself for complex historical research projects, using precise Boolean operators to narrow the vast, chaotic sea of online information. I combined Ethan's full name and his company's name with a new and more pointed set of keywords: scam, fraud, lawsuit, vanished investment, Tulum property. And the process was slow and deeply frustrating, like searching for a single, misfiled document in a vast, disorganized warehouse. For hours, my screen was filled with nothing but dead ends, generic articles about investment safety, and the same polished, deceptive marketing materials for Horizon equity partners that I had seen before. Frustration began to mount, the familiar feeling of a promising research trail growing cold. I pushed my chair back from the desk, my eyes tired and burning from the screen's relentless glare, and walked over to the living room window that overlooked the garden Richard and I had planted together in our first spring in this house. The late afternoon sun cast long, peaceful shadows across the lawn. He had always encouraged me when I hit a wall in my research. "Evelyn," he would say, "if you can't find the book you're looking for, it's time to look for a different kind of library." I had been looking for official reports, for documented cases. I needed to be looking for the storytellers, for the people who held the memories. I returned to the laptop with a renewed sense of purpose, fundamentally altering my search strategy. This time, I searched for the communities themselves, the online gathering places, investment fraud support group. I typed into the search bar, "Victims of Real Estate Scams Forum." The search results were a sad landscape of digital despair, a testament to broken trust and financial ruin. But within them, I found a link to a website that looked like a relic from another technological era. It was called Investor's Beacon, and its design was simple and clunky. With a pixelated logo and a plain text-based interface, it was a digital archive of pain, a place for people to leave warnings for those who might follow in their same unfortunate footsteps. With a feeling of quiet trepidation, I typed Ethan's company name, Horizon Equity Partners, into the forum's rudimentary search bar. My expectations low. I clicked search. One result appeared. The post was dated 3 years ago, a digital fossil buried deep in the sediment of the internet. The title was a chilling premonition that sent a cold shiver down my spine. A warning to others. The wolf in the well-tailored suit. My hand trembled as I moved the mouse to click the link. The post was written by a user with the handle Chloe B. And she wrote not with the furious anger I had expected, but with a heartbreaking and methodical clarity that resonated with my own archival soul. She described a whirlwind romance with a handsome, impossibly charming real estate broker who had swept her off her feet. He had spoken not just of buying property, but of legacy building and crafting our shared future. And he had convinced her, with his endless attention and persuasive charm, to invest her entire inheritance into an exclusive Tulum eco-resort development. She detailed, step by step, how he had subtly isolated her from her family, framing their loving caution as a lack of faith in her judgment and a threat to their happiness. She had outlined his entire playbook of deception. It was Ethan. It was his exact vocabulary, his precise methodology. Reading it was like looking at a blueprint for the trap my own daughter was now in. At the end of her long, sorrowful post, a single line of text stood apart from the rest. It was an anonymized email address, left there as a quiet beacon for anyone else who might have been pulled into the same darkness. My heart pounded in my chest, a frantic drum against my ribs. To write to this email address was to step out from behind the safety of my research. It was to make contact, to involve another human soul in this quiet, desperate war. For a long moment, my fingers hovered over the keyboard, suspended in the space between detached observation and direct action. Then, with a slow, deliberate exhale that carried the weight of my decision, I began to type. The email I composed to the anonymous address was perhaps one of the most carefully constructed documents of my entire life. I wrote and then meticulously rewrote each sentence, acutely aware that a single poorly chosen word or a hint of accusation could consign my message to the digital trash bin, forever severing this fragile, crucial link before it could be properly formed. I introduced myself not as a private investigator or an accuser, but simply as a concerned mother living in the Midwest. I explained that I had stumbled upon her 3-year-old post on the Investors Beacon forum by chance, and that the story she had so bravely shared resonated with a painful situation my own family was currently facing. I did not mention Ethan's name, nor did I reveal the full, damning extent of my own discoveries. Instead, I spoke of shared patterns, of a familiar sounding vocabulary of manipulation, and I ended my brief message by saying that if she was ever willing to speak in complete confidence, I would be profoundly grateful for the opportunity to listen. I clicked send, and an unnerving, profound silence seemed to descend upon the room. A silence filled with the weight of that one, single, outbound message. All I could do now was wait. No. For 2 long days, that silence was my constant companion. I found myself checking my email inbox with a compulsive frequency that was entirely out of character for me, each time finding it empty of the one message I so desperately sought. My initial, hard-won resolve began to fray around the edges, replaced by the disheartening fear that my outreach had been too forward, that I had inadvertently disturbed a painful past this woman had fought hard to bury and leave behind. I began to resign myself to the fact that this laid, my most promising and perhaps final one, had grown cold. Then, on the third morning, as I was listlessly sipping my morning tea and staring out at the garden, a notification pinged with a small, cheerful sound that was entirely at odds with my mood. The email was from Chloe B. It was startlingly brief, comprised of only 4 stark words: I am willing to talk, phone only. A jolt of pure adrenaline shot through me, sharp and clear. We exchanged one more email to schedule a call for that afternoon. As the appointed time approached, I prepared my study as if for a critical, formal interview. I sat at my desk with a fresh page on my legal pad and a pen, though I knew deep down that this was a conversation that would be etched directly into my memory, not my notes. When the phone rang, I answered on the first ring, my voice emerging far steadier than my trembling hands. The voice on the other end was cautious, laced with a tangible weariness that years had not managed to erase. Her name was Chloe. I began by simply telling my story, laying out the narrative of the missed birthday, the hollow, corporate-sounding excuses from my daughter, and the final, brutal revelation of the Cancun photograph. I spoke not as an investigator laying out a case, but as a mother describing the painful, bewildering process of watching her child drift away into a fog of someone else's making. As Chloe listened, I could feel a subtle shift in the energy of the call, a change from guarded silence to an engaged, empathetic stillness. When I finished, I heard her take a deep, shaky breath. "Oh, God," she whispered, her voice cracking with an emotion that sounded like a mixture of profound pity and remembered pain. "He's still doing it. It's the exact same playbook." And then Biastis. The dam of her own carefully guarded history broke. She talked for nearly an hour, and with each sentence, she filled in the terrifying gaps in my own research with painful personal details. The Tulum Eco Resort was just one of his many deceptions. She described his addiction not to cards or casinos, but to the volatile, high stakes world of day trading, a digital casino where he gambled with other people's money. He had convinced her to liquidate a portfolio of stocks she had inherited from her father, framing it as a savvy move to fund their shared legacy. That legacy, she discovered much too late, was a series of catastrophic losses he was desperately trying to cover. She articulated his method of psychological isolation with a chilling precision that made the hair on my arms stand up. He makes you the absolute center of his world, she explained, her voice thick with the sting of the memory. He does that so he can become the entire world to you. Then, slowly, methodically, he snips every other thread that connects you to your own reality, your family, your friends, until he is all you have left to trust. Before we ended the call, she promised to email me everything. A few minutes later, a new email arrived. It contained a single, password-protected zip file named The Evidence. As I typed in the password she had given me and the folder opened, revealing a list of neatly labeled documents, bank statements, emails, a fraudulent prospectus, I felt the full, crushing weight of the truth. It was no longer a suspicion, no longer a stranger story. It was a documented, verifiable, and predatory history. With the arrival of Chloe's digital files, a profound sense of finality settled over me. The investigation phase of my quiet endeavor was officially complete. The evidence I now possessed was comprehensive and irrefutable, a detailed and damning blueprint of Ethan's predatory character, built from both public records and the painful testimony of a fellow victim. But I knew. With the certainty of a lifetime spent understanding the difference between a document and its interpretation, that possessing the facts and effectively deploying them were two entirely different matters. The next few days were spent not in further research, but in a quiet, deliberate period of preparation. I understood that when confronted, Ethan would not engage with logic or evidence. His weapons of choice were emotional manipulation, condescending charm, and a particular brand of gaslighting that could make one doubt their own sanity. He would undoubtedly try to paint me as a lonely, interfering, and perhaps even senile old woman. A tired and cruel cliche I was absolutely determined to defy. My preparation, therefore, had to be both strategic in its logic and deeply personal in its resolve. It began with a small but significant act of rebellion against the image of the grieving bus. Passive widow I had allowed myself to become. I made an appointment at the hair salon I had been going to for 20 years. I want something sharp. Helen, I told my stylist. Something elegant that means business. As I looked at my reflection afterward, the weariness in my eyes was still present, a permanent shadow of my grief for Richard. But it was now overshadowed by a new and unfamiliar glint of determination. My next stop was my own closet. I pushed past the comfortable, shapeless cardigans and sensible slacks that had become my daily uniform of sorrow. From the very back, preserved in a heavy garment bag, I retrieved a deep navy blue suit of impeccably tailored wool. It was the suit Richard had bought for me to wear at my retirement dinner from the library archives, a night that had marked the closing of one major chapter of my life. You look like you own the place. Evelyn, he had whispered to me that night. Now it would mark the beginning of another, far more consequential chapter. As I buttoned the jacket, I felt a subtle shift in my posture, a straightening of my spine. The fabric felt less like clothing and more like a suit of armor. I spent an entire afternoon at my dining table, transforming from a researcher into a curator. As an archivist, I understood the profound power of narrative, that the order in which you present information can be as impactful as the information itself. I decided against a physical folder of papers. A stack of documents could be snatched, thrown across a room, or dramatically dismissed. A digital presentation, controlled by me on my laptop, was a different matter entirely. It was clean, modern, and unassailable. The presentation was structured in 3 acts, like a well-written play. The first act presented the objective, third-party facts, the public record of his suspended real estate license, the litany of negative client reviews. These were designed to establish a pattern of professional untrustworthiness. The second act was the heart of the matter, a detailed account of the financial devastation he had wrought upon Chloe, illustrated with the bank statements and fraudulent documents she had provided. The final act focused on his methodology of psychological manipulation, using direct quotes from Chloe's testimony that I knew would mirror Clara's own experiences with him. It was a story designed to unfold systematically, to dismantle his credibility piece by piece, leaving him with no plausible deniability. I rehearsed my own role in this unfolding drama, practicing my opening lines in front of the mirror, training my voice to remain calm, steady, and devoid of accusation. I would not be an emotional mother making a scene. I would be a credible narrator presenting a well-documented history. On the day I finished my preparations, I stood before the mirror in my navy blue suit. The woman who looked back at me no longer the heartbroken victim of a cruel birthday prank. She was Evelyn, the archivist, a woman who had spent her life preserving truths and who was now about to use that skill to save her own daughter. The feeling was not one of vengeful glee, but of a grim and necessary duty. The exhibit was ready. It was time to open the doors. The week following their return from Cancun was a masterclass in strained politeness. Clara and I spoke on the phone twice, our conversations carefully navigating a vast, unspoken territory of anger and deliberate avoidance. She spoke of her fading tan and the overwhelming difficulty of getting back into her work routine. I spoke of the changing colors of the autumn leaves and a new biography I was reading. We were two strangers performing a painful, stilted pantomime of our old mother-daughter relationship, and the artifice was exhausting. I knew I could not allow this charade to continue. I needed to see her, to speak with her alone, away from the ever-present, watchful influence of her husband. I finally called her on a Thursday afternoon, using a small, domestic lie as my necessary invitation. I told her the new wireless printer I'd bought was stubbornly refusing to connect to my laptop. A plausible frustration for a woman of my generation? I asked, in a voice I hoped sounded merely weary, if she might have a moment to spare in the coming days to help her technologically inept mother. A faint sigh came through the line, a sound of dutiful impatience that pained me more than any angry word could have. I'm really swamped at work. Mom, she said, her voice tight. But I suppose I can swing by for an hour tomorrow afternoon. She arrived the next day precisely at 2 o'clock, already glancing at her phone as she stepped through the front door. Okay, let's see this printer, she said, her tone that of a busy executive making a reluctant and time-sensitive house call. I did not lead her to the study where the perfectly functioning printer sat in quiet readiness. Instead, I guided her into the living room, gesturing toward the armchair opposite the one where I always sat. My laptop was already open on the coffee table between us, its screen dark. The printer can wait. Clara, I said, my voice carefully modulated to be calm and gentle. The voice I once used at the library when handling a rare, fragile manuscript that might turn to dust if handled improperly. There is something far more important that we need to talk about. She looked at me then. Truly looked at me. A flicker of guarded annoyance hardening her eyes. Mom, if this is about my birthday again, I really don't have the emotional bandwidth for it right now. It's about your husband, I replied, my voice quiet but firm. A stone dropping into a still pond. Her posture immediately stiffened, her back straightening into a defensive line. I turned the laptop so the screen faced her and woke it from its sleep. On it was the first slide of my presentation, a clean, simple screenshot from the state's professional regulation website showing the public record of Ethan's 90-day license suspension. I was concerned about some of your shared finances, I began, choosing my words with the deliberate care of an archivist labeling a priceless artifact. And in the course of looking into things, I came across some public records that I found deeply troubling. Clara stared at the screen, her brow furrowed. He already told me all about that, she said, her voice a shield of practiced dismissal. It was a complete and utter misunderstanding with a very difficult client. It has been fully resolved. I said nothing, simply clicking to the next slide. It showed the collection of negative reviews, with the damning phrases about the Mexican resort development highlighted in a stark, unavoidable yellow. Her defensiveness grew, her cheeks flushing with an angry color. Anonymous people on the internet, Mom. This is desperate. You are just digging for dirt because you cannot accept that I am happy with him. Her voice was rising now, taking on the familiar cadence of a speech I suspected she had rehearsed with Ethan many times. You've never trusted my judgment, and you're just trying to drive a wedge between us. I proceeded to the next slide, a sanitized, anonymous summary of Chloe's harrowing story, detailing the lost inheritance and the predatory pattern of financial abuse. I watched my daughter's face closely as she read the words. The defiant anger in her eyes began to waver, replaced by a shadow of something else, a terrified, unwilling confusion. The story was too specific, the methodology too eerily familiar. She stood up abruptly, pushing the laptop away on the coffee table as if its surface had become searing hot. I don't believe you, she whispered, her voice trembling with a chaotic mixture of rage and burgeoning fear. You hate him. You have hated him from the very start. She walked to the door, her movement stiff and jerky, the fluid grace she usually possessed completely gone. With her hand on the cold brass doorknob, she paused but did not turn around. Why would you do this to me? She asked, her voice cracking under the immense strain of her collapsing defenses. Because I love you, I replied to her rigid back, my own voice thick with unshed tears. And I don't believe that you are safe. She wrenched the door open and left without another word, the sound of her car's tires screeching as she sped away down our quiet suburban street felt like a final, devastating judgment. I sat alone in the crushing silence of the house, enveloped by the terrifying fear that in my desperate attempt to save her, I had just lost her for good. The day that followed our raw and painful confrontation was one of the longest and most silent of my life. I moved through the familiar rooms of my house in a state of profound and anxious dread, my own home now feeling like a tomb of my own making. Every time the phone rang, my heart would leap into my throat with a painful mixture of hope and fear, but it was never her. I replayed our conversation endlessly in my mind, scrutinizing every word, every gesture, every flicker of emotion that had crossed her face. Had I been too harsh, too clinical? Had my carefully prepared, evidence-based presentation only served to build a higher, more impenetrable wall between us? The fear that I had made a terrible, irreversible miscalculation was a constant, sickening weight in the pit of my stomach. I was beginning to surrender to a quiet, gray despair, the belief that I had truly and finally severed my last connection to my daughter. When I heard the faint, familiar sound of a key turning in the front door lock. It was late in the afternoon on the second day. Clara stood in the entryway, looking like a pale, disheveled ghost of her former, polished self. Her expensive clothes were wrinkled as if she had slept in them. Her eyes were red-rimmed and swollen, and she clutched her personal laptop to her chest like a piece of armor. She did not offer an apology or an explanation for her sudden appearance. She simply looked at me, her gaze hollow and unfocused, and said in a small, thin voice, I need some space. Can I please stay here tonight? I nodded, my throat suddenly too tight to form words. Your room, I managed to say, is always ready for you. She walked past me without another word, a stranger in her own home, and went up the stairs to her childhood bedroom, closing the door softly, but definitively. Behind her, I did not follow. I understood with a primal, maternal instinct that this was a journey she had to complete alone. My part in it, for now, was over. I had presented the map, She had to be the one to recognize the perilous terrain she was on. I went into the kitchen and made a pot of tea I had no intention of drinking. The simple domestic act, a small anchor in a vast sea of uncertainty. I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where she had once done her homework and chattered endlessly about her school day. And I waited. The hours stretched on, marked only by the shifting of the autumn light outside the window. I could hear faint sounds from upstairs, the soft, intermittent clicking of a keyboard, the muffled sound of a sharp sob that she tried to suppress, the weary creak of the floorboards as she paced back and forth, from one wall to the other. I was suspended in a state of helpless, agonizing anticipation. My evidence had not been enough to convince her. She had needed to see it for herself, through her own eyes, on her own terms, without my influence. It was the only way the truth could ever hope to breach the formidable fortress of denial that Ethan had so expertly and cruelly constructed around her heart. Around dusk, her bedroom door opened. I heard her footsteps on the stairs, slow and heavy, as if each step required a monumental and painful effort. She came into the kitchen and sat down in the chair opposite me, the space between us charged with a heavy, unspoken truth. She looked defeated, hollowed out by a sorrow so profound it seemed to have physically diminished her, making her look smaller, more fragile. Wordlessly, she turned her own laptop to face me. On the screen was their shared credit card statement, an endless, damning scroll of transactions. My eyes scanned the lines of text. There were charges from websites I didn't recognize, with sordid names like Apex Poker and Global Bet. There were multiple cash withdrawals from ATMs located just outside casinos in states they had never mentioned visiting. And there were the purchases, thousands upon thousands of dollars of them, Sess, from high-end electronics stores and exclusive designer boutiques, for items I knew with absolute certainty my practical, sensible daughter did not own and would never buy for herself. Clara had finally opened the door to the secret, locked room in her marriage, Sasset's, and the contents had shattered her. I slowly looked up from the screen and met her gaze. Her eyes, once so bright, were now filled with a silent, devastating understanding. There was no need for "I told you so." There was no victory in being right. There was only a shared, profound sorrow for the beautiful trust that had been broken. I reached across the table and took her cold, trembling hand in mine. She squeezed it tightly, a silent, desperate acknowledgement of the truth that now lay exposed and ugly between us. Her carefully constructed world had been built on a foundation of lies, and it had finally, irrevocably, collapsed. The immediate aftermath of Clara's raw discovery was not one of strategic planning, but of profound and necessary grief. She sat at my kitchen table, her face buried in her hands, and she wept with the wrenching, soul-deep sobs of someone who has been forced to mourn the death of a man who is still alive. She cried for the beautiful illusion she had cherished, for the trust she had so freely and lovingly given, and for the months she had spent allowing his quiet poison to seep into her heart, slowly turning her against the very person who had always been her safest harbor. I did not offer platitudes or easy reassurances. There were none to give. I simply sat with her in the gathering twilight, my hand resting on her trembling shoulders, and I bore witness to her sorrow. I understood that this agony was a cleansing fire, a necessary crucible she had to pass through to burn away the last vestiges of his insidious influence and emerge on the other side, ready for what had to be done. We stayed like that for a long time, the silence of the room punctuated only by her sorrow, until her tears finally subsided into a state of exhausted, hollowed-out calm. It was in that quiet aftermath, as the first pale stars began to appear in the dark sky outside the kitchen window, that a new and formidable resolve began to form in her. I saw it in the way her posture gradually straightened, in the way she wiped the last of the tears from her face with a gesture not of weakness, but of grim finality. Her eyes, when she finally looked up at me, were no longer filled with the shattered confusion of a victim. They were cold, clear, and shining with a hard, unfamiliar light that seemed to reflect the steely truth she now possessed. "He can't get away with this," she said, her voice low and steady, entirely devoid of the emotional tremor it had held just hours before. "He cannot be allowed to do this to anyone else. Ever again." In that moment, she was no longer just my daughter in need of rescue. She had become my partner, my ally in a war she hadn't known she was fighting. The rest of the evening was spent in quiet, intense collaboration. We sat at the kitchen table, the two of us, a council of war lit by the soft glow of a single lamp, our legal pads side by side. We decided that a public confrontation would be messy and unpredictable, while a purely private one could be dangerous for her later on. The plan we formulated was a delicate and dangerous hybrid, a carefully orchestrated piece of theater to be performed on our own stage, my home. There was one final, critical piece to our plan, the one that would transform the confrontation from a messy argument into an undeniable verdict. "There is someone else he needs to face," I said softly into the quiet of the room. "Someone whose story proves that his cruelty is not an accident, but a well-rehearsed method." I explained everything about Chloe, about my research, and our long, heartbreaking conversation. Clara listened intently, her expression hardening with each detail I shared, the knowledge that she was not the first victim seeming to galvanize her further. That night, with Clara's full and firm agreement, I sent one last email to Chloe, outlining our plan and asking if she would be willing to play the final, crucial role via a video call. Her reply came within the hour. For her, and for me, "I'll do it." The next afternoon, the stage was set. It was Clara who made the call to Ethan. I sat beside her, a silent observer, my heart aching with a fierce mixture of pride for her courage and sorrow for the performance she was forced to give. I watched her take several deep, steadying breaths, her face transforming into a mask of convincing fragility and regret. Her voice, when she spoke, was a masterful symphony of weakness and contrition. "Ethan, you were right," she began, a believable tremor in her tone. "I completely overreacted. My mom, she was so out of line." A pause, perfectly timed. "She feels terrible about it. She wants to apologize to you, to both of us. She wants us to come over for dinner tomorrow, just to clear the air so we can all move forward." She listened for a moment, her eyes fixed on a distant point on the wall, her knuckles white as she gripped her phone. "Yes, I know. I'll be there. Of course," she finished, her voice a near whisper. After she hung up the phone, she let out a long, shuddering breath, her body trembling with the sheer effort of the deception. His response had been exactly what we had anticipated: smug, condescending, and magnanimously willing to accept the apology he felt he was so richly owed. The trap was now set. The bait had been taken. The day of the dinner arrived with a heavy, portentous stillness. The very air in the house seemed charged, thick with unspoken words and a silent, controlled tension. Claire and I moved around the kitchen in a quiet, synchronized dance, our preparations starkly different from those of my failed birthday party just weeks before. There were no festive decorations, no elaborate recipes designed to delight. We prepared a simple meal of roasted chicken and vegetables, our movements efficient and purposeful, like two surgeons preparing an operating theater. This was not a celebration. It was a carefully planned procedure. My laptop sat discreetly on the sideboard in the dining room, already open and connected to a stable internet connection. A silent digital guillotine awaiting its moment. We were two soldiers in a quiet war, preparing our battlefield with methodical, almost reverent care. Ethan arrived at precisely 7 o'clock. Not with the cautious demeanor of someone entering a tense situation, but with the triumphant, easy swagger of a conquering hero returning to claim his spoils. He held a bottle of expensive Cabernet, a prop in his performance of magnanimity, He greeted me with a condescendingly warm smile that never reached his cold eyes and gave Clara a proprietary kiss on the cheek, completely oblivious to the icy resolve that now fortified her, a wall he could not see. "I'm so glad we're doing this," he said, his voice as smooth as polished stone as he surveyed the simple dinner setting. "Open communication, you see, is the key to a healthy, functioning family." We sat down at the dining table, the same table where my daughter's world had collapsed into ruins just 2 nights before. The meal was a surreal, tension-filled performance. Ethan, in his element, dominated the conversation with an unctuous charm. He spoke at length about the importance of family unity and the absolute necessity of maintaining healthy boundaries with one's parents, all the while directing pointed, meaningful looks at me. He was not just anticipating an apology, he was delivering a victory speech before a captive audience. Claire and I said very little, offering only the occasional noncommittal murmur or slight nod, allowing him to weave his own narrative, to build his own pedestal higher and higher upon a foundation of lies. He graciously offered to pour the expensive wine he had brought, lecturing us on its complex notes and exclusive vintage. A self-appointed king holding court in a kingdom he did not know was on the brink of revolution. He was so completely wrapped up in his own suffocating arrogance, so certain of his unbreakable control over my daughter, that he was utterly blind to the cold, clear-eyed judgment that was watching him from across the table. After he had finished his main course and was leaning back in his chair, swirling the deep red wine in his glass with a look of supreme and utter satisfaction, I knew the moment had arrived. I slowly placed my fork and knife down on my plate, the small, sharp sound of metal against china cutting through his self-aggrandizing monologue. "Ethan," I said, my voice startlingly calm and even in the quiet room. "You have spoken a great deal about family and honesty tonight, and before I offer the apology, you have so graciously come here to receive. There is someone else who I believe has been waiting to speak with you for a very long time." Confusion flickered across his handsome face, quickly replaced by a look of mild irritation at having his performance interrupted. I stood up from the table and walked over to the sideboard. With deliberate, unhurried movements that belied the frantic pounding of my heart, I turned the laptop to face him and maximized the active video call window. The screen flickered to life, revealing the clear, composed face of a woman in her late 30s, her expression calm, her gaze direct and unblinking. It was Chloe. I watched Ethan's face as he processed the impossible image before him. It was a slow, devastating, and complete transformation. The smug arrogance drained away first, as if a plug had been pulled, replaced by a wave of pure, slack-jawed disbelief. That disbelief then curdled into the dawning horror of comprehension. And finally, into the wide-eyed, primal panic of a cornered animal that has just realized the trap has irrevocably snapped shut around it. He looked from the screen to me, then to Clara, his mind frantically trying and failing to compute this impossible reality. Chloe's voice, clear and steady through the computer's speakers, filled the ringing, cavernous silence of the room. "Hello, Ethan," she said, a faint, sad smile touching her lips. "It's been a while. I hear you've been working on some new legacy projects." The quiet words landed with the force of a physical blow, and in the space of that single, terrifying moment, his entire, carefully constructed world, built on a foundation of lies and manipulation, finally and utterly imploded. The profound, ringing silence that followed Chloe's final, devastating word was shattered by Ethan. His reaction was not one of quiet shame or dignified retreat, but a desperate and grotesquely ugly unraveling of his carefully constructed persona. The mask of the charming, magnanimous husband fell away completely, revealing the snarling, cornered animal beneath, lashing out in its final moments of capture. His handsome face, once so composed, became a contorted canvas of pure rage and disbelief. He lunged to his feet, knocking his heavy dining chair over with a loud, jarring clatter that echoed the sudden chaos that had erupted in the room. A string of vile, incoherent accusations poured from his lips, directed first at me, then at the disembodied face of Chloe still serenely on the screen, and finally, with the most concentrated venom, at Clara. He called her ungrateful, foolish, a naive traitor who had been systematically poisoned against him by a bitter, lonely old woman. It was a desperate, flailing attempt to regain control through sheer verbal force, to bully reality itself into bending back to his will. But his power in this house, his insidious influence in my daughter's heart, had been decisively and permanently extinguished. It was Clara who rose to meet his tirade, not with shouts and tears, but with a quiet, unshakable firmness that seemed to absorb all the energy from his rage and render it impotent. "Get out, Ethan," she said, her voice low and devoid of any emotion save for a chilling and absolute finality. "Get out of my mother's house. Now." He stared at her, momentarily stunned into silence by this new, unrecognizable version of the woman he thought he so thoroughly controlled. He opened his mouth to retort, to unleash another torrent of abuse. But seeing the absolute, unbreakable resolve in her eyes, he seemed to understand that his performance was, at long last, truly over. With one last look of pure, undiluted hatred directed at me, he snatched his coat from the chair and stormed out of the house, slamming the front door behind him with a force that rattled the very windows in their frames. A final, petulant act of violence against the peace he could no longer disrupt. In the deafening silence that he left in his wake, Claire and I stood for a long moment, the aftershock of the confrontation still trembling in the air. On the laptop screen, Chloe's face was filled with a deep and compassionate sadness. "I'm so sorry you both had to witness that," she said softly. We thanked her, our words feeling small and inadequate to express the immense gratitude we felt for her quiet courage. After the call ended, Clara finally collapsed into a chair, not with the violent sobs of before, but with the quiet, weary tears of pure emotional exhaustion. The main battle was over, but the long, arduous work of healing and rebuilding had only just begun. The following Monday morning, we sat in the quiet, sunlit office of a divorce attorney, a woman with kind, intelligent eyes and a firm, no-nonsense demeanor. As Clara recounted the painful story, the lawyer listened with a patient, practiced empathy, occasionally making sharp, precise notes on a legal pad. The cold, hard mechanics of the law became our new and welcome reality. We filed for a restraining order that morning, a necessary shield against the predictable barrage of harassing phone calls and increasingly erratic emails that had already begun. Messages that cycled wildly between desperate, pleading apologies and thinly veiled threats. The legal process was a slow, grinding machine, but it was also a structured path forward, a way to methodically untangle Clara from the insidious web of debt and deceit Ethan had woven around her without her knowledge. Our attorney was confident that we could protect Clara's personal assets and hold Ethan legally responsible for the gambling debts he had accrued in their name. Clara stayed with me in her childhood bedroom for the next 3 months, the room becoming a quiet cocoon for her recovery. There were days of profound silence, days of sudden, unexpected tears, and long, quiet evenings where we would simply talk, rediscovering the easy intimacy that had been stolen from us. We looked through old photo albums, not to dwell on a lost past, but to help her reconnect with the bright, confident young woman who smiled back from the glossy pages. Slowly, tentatively, like the first green shoots of spring emerging after a long, hard winter. The light began to return to her eyes. The storm had passed, and though the wreckage was still all around us, we were beginning the quiet, hopeful work of clearing the debris and finding the solid foundations beneath. The morning of my 71st birthday arrived not with a sense of quiet dread and lonely anticipation, but with the gentle, welcome sound of my daughter humming a cheerful, off-key tune in the kitchen. The contrast with the previous year was so profound, so absolute, that it felt like I was remembering a scene from someone else's life. a sad story I had once read in a book. The air in my home was filled not with anxious silence, but with the warm, comforting aroma of freshly brewed coffee and cinnamon rolls baking in the oven. Instead of the solitary ritual of preparing for a party that would never happen, Claire and I stood side by side at the kitchen counter, our movements easy and familiar, our quiet conversation punctuated by shared, genuine laughter. The house no longer felt like a vast, empty archive of memories of what had been lost. It felt like a home again, vibrant and filled with the simple, joyful promise of the day ahead. Our celebration that evening was not a large, formal affair, but an intimate gathering of the small, strong circle our lives had become. We sat in the backyard, in the garden that Richard and I had planted so many years ago, surrounded by the gentle glow of string lights that Clara had hung, their warm light twinkling like captured stars. Our few guests were a testament to our new, carefully rebuilt world. Our friendly neighbors, the Martinezes, were there, their easy warmth and booming laughter, a constant comfort. Two of Clara's oldest friends from college, women she had reconnected with in the past year, sat beside her, their presence a joyful reminder of the strong, independent life that had existed before Ethan. And in a chair of honor, holding a glass of iced tea and lemon, was Chloe. We had stayed in touch weekly, our shared experience forging an unlikely but powerful long-distance friendship built on mutual respect and understanding. She had flown in from the East Coast for the weekend, her calm, intelligent presence a living symbol of the strength that can be found in shared survival. Clara herself was transformed, radiating a quiet, hard-won confidence. She had not only finalized the divorce, successfully and completely extricating herself from Ethan's financial ruin, but she had also enrolled in a landscape design program at the local college. The way she spoke about soil composition and perennial bloom cycles was filled with a rediscovered passion that filled my heart with a quiet joy. Her happiness was her own, cultivated from the ground up, and it was a beautiful, resilient thing to witness. When Clara brought out the birthday cake, its single, bright candle flickering in the twilight, I was surrounded by the gentle, off-key singing of people who genuinely cared for me. A year ago, this house was a tomb of silence. Tonight, it was a symphony of soft laughter and easy conversation. As I looked at their smiling faces, at my daughter, so strong and whole and radiant, I felt a wave of profound gratitude wash over me. A year ago, my most desperate wish would have been for this exact moment to have my daughter back, to feel safe, to feel a sense of peace. But as I closed my eyes and took a breath to blow out the candle, I realized with a sudden, beautiful clarity that I no longer needed to wish for anything. I had everything I needed right here in the quiet warmth of my garden. Later that evening, after the last of our guests had departed, Claire and I sat together on the porch swing, a comfortable silence settling between us like a soft blanket. She handed me a small, beautifully wrapped gift. Inside was a framed, first edition copy of my favorite book of poetry, a thoughtful and deeply personal gesture that spoke volumes. "Happy birthday, Mom," she said softly, leaning her head on my shoulder. "Thank you for being my archivist. You saved my story." I squeezed her hand, my heart too full for words. We sat there for a long time, watching the first fireflies begin to blink their gentle, intermittent light in the growing darkness. Two survivors who had navigated a terrible storm and found their way back to the quiet, steady shores of home. The peace was not a gift. It was a victory, hard won, and all the more precious for it.